Great. So welcome everyone to our fourth and final conversation in this specific series. We're going to be talking about AI and ethics, especially considering AI's role in a post-automation world, what that means for us, what that means for society writ large. It's an interesting topic. It means it's going to be a slightly different conversation. We're not going to necessarily talk about technology as in depth as we've had in the first three conversations, but of course it will play an integral part. And as always, Conan, I'll rely on you to translate for me a lot of the core concepts, but it's going to be a bit more of a polemic. We've identified four topics that we're really eager to discuss together and then share with you. And these topics will start with autonomy, or autonomous machines. We'll go into the concept of bias, which is a very hot topic today when it comes to ethics. We'll get into something that I'm quite interested in personally, which is the concept of ownership and who owns what. And then finally, we'll finish off on a brief overview of some of our considerations for life in a post-automation world and what that might look like, what some of the challenges are. So we're going to go back and forth a bit, Conan, right? And we'll probably disagree on a few things. And even where we do agree, hopefully we'll come up with some counter arguments that at least challenge some of our assumptions around the topics we're bringing up. So this is a fun one. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Let's have it, Phill.
Yeah. Okay. So autonomy. Why don't we get started kind of just on autonomy? Maybe you can give us just a brief definition of autonomous machines. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So I guess autonomy is an autonomous agent is an agent that makes decisions, right? So you might think that software in general is making decisions because there isn't someone guiding its every step, but actually with deterministic software that isn't using machine learning or statistics to make decisions, almost everything that it does has been pre-decided by the person who developed the system.
Got it.
Right? Okay. On the other hand, an autonomous system is making decisions that no one necessarily planned, right? And that have possibly never been made before, right? So, I mean, we have examples such as autonomous weapons, a big discussion point in the ethics of artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and so on. We see some systems now that are reaching the news cycle, such as DeepMind's projects with game playing. The AlphaGo software, they developed their new StarCraft system that we've seen already that makes decisions that no one could have foreseen, that actually no one even understood. Even professional Go players didn't, couldn't really understand or would never themselves have made some of the moves that the system was making.
Right.
So, but yeah, in a nutshell, an autonomous system is one that makes decisions that weren't explicitly pre-programmed and that couldn't have been devised in advance by the designer of the system.
The programmer. Okay, so challenging because of the unknown outcome, and I guess there's an element of framing of the algorithm, what the outcome should be, what the application should be to sort of get you from point A to point B. Obviously, in a confined environment like playing Go, the kind of the input and output, if you will, is relatively constrained, and the machine is trying to win, right? But then obviously it becomes much more complex when we're talking about autonomous vehicles and autonomous weapons, especially. So that's an interesting one. I think this question I've been thinking about a lot, which is actually how do you ensure that there is a framework, that there are limitations, because that infers there's some kind of design work and some kind of programming, but then you want the machine to operate within a framework like that. Does that sound realistic, that you could create a framework like that?
So this is, I mean, immediately, there's so much happening here. Immediately, ethical concerns and discussions start to arise, even from this concept of what was going on with AlphaGo, right? The system was making decisions that humans didn't understand. Right?
Yeah.
And they were eventually successful, right? The system finally beat the player it was up against, right? You just step back and put that idea into other contexts, like systems of traffic systems, right? thousands of autonomous cars driving around, and some decision emerges from the system for some truly strange behavior from some of the vehicles that might cause accidents, right?
Yeah.
Is the system malfunctioning, or is it making decisions that further down the line, maybe it's predicting that by taking the sacrifice, maybe something down the line that it's planned that it could actually lower the cost to humans on aggregate by making that decision.
Right.
Right.
And that's kind of giving it this utilitarian framework, right? But it almost, it's almost asking the question, how does it come up with that framework? But then also, who's responsible for giving it that specific outcome, as opposed to saying, no, this is unacceptable at all times.
Exactly.
It's an interesting distinction to make.
Exactly. So even before anything, how comfortable are we with the idea of systems making decisions that, never mind whether they're right or wrong, that we simply don't understand?
Yeah.
Right. And that they can't explain. The system is not going to have any way necessarily to explain to you why it's doing what it's doing.
Right.
Right. That's again something that, if you want to start talking about solutions, right? You were talking about a framework for limiting the types of decisions that these systems make. That might be very difficult. In our last talk, we were talking about decision spaces. Language is one thing, but I mean, if you look at the material world, things are just infinitely complex.
Yeah.
Right. To explain your every move, right? But if we can create components to these systems that can explain why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right. That can use a language that we understand to tell you, I'm doing this because I foresee such and such happening down the future. Maybe that's how you create something around that people will be more comfortable with, and that addresses some of the ethical concerns.
Yeah, explainability is probably a pretty important step. It doesn't quite eliminate, I guess, the challenge around responsibility, right? Because I think we in society, we all make decisions, right? Big and small, every single day. What do I wear? Do I drink coffee this morning? It's usually a yes. But we all make decisions that are big and small. Some of them are larger than others. But even when you're responsible for, a project failing at work or a car accident, something more serious like that, people are held responsible in those types of circumstances. Hopefully they are anyway. What happens when there's an algorithm that takes a decision that has a negative effect on someone? That element of responsibility, even if it was in purpose of a greater good, becomes pretty complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, liability. So one of the things that I believe that is holding sort of a bit of a damper on the automated vehicle industry is exactly this, that it's such a huge unsolved or unresolved issue of this, what you're talking about, of liability and responsibility. Mm-hmm. If two autonomous vehicles from different manufacturers collide in an accident and people are harmed, how do you modify the insurance system to deal with this? We've got something in place that's worked very well for a long time, where each person is sort of liable for their own behavior, their own choices.
Mm-hmm. And then it also brings up, I think we're going into this direction because responsibility we associate more with norms and values, and then liability is more associated, as you said, with kind of legal and insurance and the kind of the structures of our lives. So if there's an autonomous vehicle accident, let's take the example of the Uber crash. It's very tragic. Unfortunately, in Arizona, that a lady was killed while crossing the road late at night, and the guided driver was not paying sufficient attention. So a very, very sad case. But Uber has actually just been exonerated from criminal liability by the county in question. But it doesn't mean that they'll escape civil suit. And I think separately, the county is actually being taken to court regardless. So, you kind of think about, okay, from a liability perspective, is the company liable? Maybe. Is the government that sanctioned the use of those algorithms liable? Again, maybe, right? So we need to start, it's almost like we're in this gray zone, right? Where we don't really know, okay, responsibility, who's actually responsible, liability, it's another level of complexity.
Yeah.
We almost don't really know where we stand against these.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how comfortable are people handing over their lives to manufacturers of autonomous vehicles, or at least the people creating software for them?
Yeah.
Right. I think there's a certain, there's a certain value people have in maybe having your life in your own hands rather than someone else's. But at the same time, you're suddenly making driving a vehicle a heck of a lot cheaper for everybody, because
and safer.
And safer, yeah. Well, potentially.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
So there's a lot of questions still to be answered there, and we haven't even gone into autonomous weapons, for instance, where there's no insurance system in war, right? There isn't a mechanism to correct for. We don't have any international treaties. There don't seem to be any on the horizon to deal with problems such as when an automated or an autonomous weapon makes an incorrect decision, right, and harms or possibly kills the wrong people or civilians. So there's a lot of questions in there. Things could go a lot of different ways. We could see positives emerge, as well as negatives.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing that's also worth noting in this conversation, is that when we think about things like autonomous vehicles, the track record so far, and there's been, I believe, millions of hours of driving time between the likes of Google, Uber, and others, and fatalities are extremely low. In fact, much lower than the average, like far lower than the average level of accidents and death toll. So already with a limited sample size, success of these vehicles is far higher. The number of people that are killed, unfortunately, every year in driving accidents. So that's one element. Imagine also with autonomous weapons, well, you can create a framework where you don't have to put soldiers into dangerous situations. That's also a positive thing.
Yeah.
But again, provided that there's a kind of a framework, there's explainability, there's some kind of oversight, right, that we don't yet have, legal as well as functional.
Definitely. And people, what we're not really talking about, or we're sometimes failing to realize, is that there are a lot of securities we take for granted, right, that are in our societies that emerge from our value systems, right? So, and they don't work universally, right? And so let's say in situations of war, there are people who do bad things in war. We all know that. But there are also a lot of people who make the right choice, right? Who work in the military and so on. Because we grow up in a value system today where harming people is considered immoral if it's unnecessary, or if it's not to protect yourself and so on. So we rely on these value systems to create sort of basic securities in the social structure. These automated technologies, automation technologies such as cars or weapons, let's say, they're not, we aren't embedding value systems into these systems. Where most of the technology underlying it right now is basically focused around building a system that targets a goal, right? Everything else beside that goal is usually collateral damage, right? Anything that works towards that goal is considered a good thing. And those goals might be to reduce harm to people, right? Those could be a part of those goals. But we're going to have to think very carefully, and I think we'll probably speak about this throughout the conversation, but how do we start to embed sometimes fairly crude but functional human value systems into these machines, automated machines.
Got it. Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of this other layer of AI that is not so clear. How do you overlay kind of the Isaac Asimov's 3 rules for my robot? How do you make sure that those securities are there? Those safeguards are there. And I think we're talking about relatively relatively weighty topics with transportation and especially autonomous weapons. I'd also have to consider the idea of something that's a bit more oblique, but certainly no less insidious, right? Where you've got systems that maybe are influencing you to buy, or that are negotiating with you, or say systems that would enrich you, like a smart stockbroker, right? So, imagine I'm renegotiating the lease on my apartment, for example, right? And an AI's got all the inferences on length of time that I've been there, the amount of issues I've had with my landlord, the amount of complaints I've raised, and then all this other data about me as well. And then you can start to say, okay, well, here's the way I can get here's the way to get Phill to drive to get to the best price possible, highest price possible. Yeah. And especially if you can use aggregated data, that's a hugely unfair advantage to get someone to where you want them to be, right? So that's a very difficult thing to legislate for, but then also to safeguard against. Right?
Yeah, well, this is something I think is very problematic. And again, we're not talking about the solutions enough. So you're talking about something that, like, selling to you an artificial intelligence that sells to you and is sort of optimizing towards that goal regardless of your global well-being, let's say. This is already happening, right? We think that, for this to cross over into artificial intelligence, or, because of the sci-fi view of AI, we think that unless it's a natural language artificial intelligence that's actually speaking to you and negotiating with you about buying something from them, unless it's that, we don't really see it. But if you're on social media, right? What are the easiest ways, for example, to get you to buy an alarm system for your house, right? On Facebook, right? Well, the first thing I would try is to push a news story about maybe burglaries or violent crime in your neighborhood, right?
Right.
So here you have a system that's trying to influence you to purchase something by frightening you, right? So you don't necessarily need some genius manipulator AI to be sitting there speaking with you, frightening you that way. This is already happening. And how do we deal with the the ethics surrounding that? So there are a lot of questions there that we're gonna have to think hard about. In terms of what type of autonomy, what boundaries do we lay down for the autonomy we grant to these systems, and whether they can influence people.
Yeah, the other thing, I think that's right. I think that's the important way to kind of frame the discussion of autonomy. Let's move over to bias, because I think you touched on a few ideas already, which is about kind of value systems versus information and statistics. I think bias is something that we see coming up quite a lot. So with bias, can you frame the problem a little bit for us? Why do you think bias occurs? What are some of the contributing factors, do you think?
So I think, this actually, this idea we were talking about human value systems versus these like statistically programmed systems, let's say, is again relevant here. When you train a machine learning model on data to try to predict new data, you're always relying on statistical aggregates, right? So if you're a shop owner and you've installed a security system and you want to predict shoplifting, right, from some kind of live camera that's like watching over your shop, maybe younger people are far more likely to shoplift than older people. I'm taking a guess, but it might be true. So the system, so within that underlying data set, the system starts noticing that maybe people who are shorter, people who starts noticing attributes and features of younger people, and the system starts learning that bias, right? This immediately means that people in that age group who are innocent are suddenly more likely to be flagged as potential shoplifters, right? So you can imagine the underlying problems with that, right? Suddenly you're flagging people for certain attributes of their identity, right? Which might be gender-based, or it might be ethnic background, or like we said, age group, or it might be socioeconomic. And this is something that contrasts pretty strongly with our sort of contemporary value systems. We think, you know, if you ask me, I would say that you should suspect people for their actions, not for their age group, their gender.
Those are just indicators. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. You should suspect people for the way that they're behaving and acting, and their track record, rather than those things. So, but how do you build that into these systems, right? Well, first of all, you're asking whoever's building the systems to possibly lose some performance, right? Because you're removing information from the data. But the way that I see it, that's really the only way to do it. You have to find a way to sort of whitewash out of your learning data these things that could end up making generalizations about people that are actually unfair, and sort of attributing, you know, and causing problems for people who don't deserve them.
Right.
We're talking about shoplifting here, but you could also think about bank loans and mortgage agreements.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're basing your predictor on things like that, then suddenly people who, again, might be in their early 20s, who are more likely to default on their mortgage, people who would happily pay their mortgage on time suddenly can't get one, right?
Right.
And you're basing that only because of some aspect of their identity.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of issues in there, and there's a lot of work happening here. There was a publication in, I think it was 2018, at ICML, which is one of the biggest machine learning conferences. There was the winning paper there, and it was and you know, dealing with this issue of fairness and machine learning and so on. So this is a big topic.
It's being looked at. I think, you know, another thing that strikes me about that's challenging around this is that not only are you need to remove certain elements that lead to bias because of the way the data is being collected or what have you, but it's almost like the designer of the system needs to know that there is bias in the first place, right? And then know which systems to isolate. And I think, you know, we've talked about shoplifting, you know, so it's a straightforward example, but then there's going to be lots of applications of machine learning that will actually be very complicated. So understanding, you know, what are the pieces in the data that we need to remove and we need to ignore, and even realizing there's a problem in the first place, I think is inherently problematic with the notion of bias. So it's one thing that's going to be very challenging. I guess it also relates back to our conversation about autonomy.
Definitely, yeah. Another thing that, that relates back is, again, it does come back to what we were talking about, that for these systems to work in harmony with people, we need to find clever ways to make sure that they address people's most fundamental concerns in terms of their values and their beliefs in the way that they think that society should operate. And value systems are usually, in some way or other, actually fairly utilitarian. So for instance, you might think that it's maybe not rational to only base a criminal conviction on people's behavior rather than, like we mentioned, their age group, right? But I think it is rational, because the value created from the well-being derived when what you expect of the society you live in is that people will not prejudge you for things that you shouldn't necessarily be judged for. The sort of emotional well-being that creates all across a society is enough to probably create significant economic growth, right? So, value systems do tend to have sometimes indirect sort of underlying rational underlying rational sources, and when we and they've emerged from a lot of trial and error, through every town, every city, all over the world. That one place does this and another does that, and then the more successful one progresses, and then people copy it and so on.
Sure.
So
yeah, I think that's interesting, and but it's also, I guess, dependent on the context, right? Because it's certain certain value systems we would not find appropriate, for example, value systems that discriminate against gender or race, which is the case in some countries, unfortunately. So it's also considering, what is the value system that we want to uphold, and this also reminds me of the kind of the do-gooder, Silicon Valley tech person who thinks that their technology is changing the world and making the world a better place, and oftentimes there's unintended consequences. What I would say, though, is actually I think the fact that AI can highlight bias is actually not a bad thing, because if you look at the U.S. criminal justice example, which is a quite widely quoted example of being tremendous bias in the system, which of course there is, that's actually shining a light on looking at all those previous cases and showing that there is real bias against African American men of a certain age group and background, and their treatment, based on specific infractions that weren't as heavily penalized for white people. So, that's actually recognizing that is a positive thing. I think there's something good about that in there. But of course, we need to make sure that performance, as you said, is not only going forward is not based on it looking back. Fine.
Yeah. But you've made a very good counterpoint that as soon as it becomes accepted that you can, and as soon as we solve the technical problems of imposing value systems on technology, immediately you're relying on those value systems being rational and being fair. Yeah. Right.
And then who says that they are, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And as you mentioned, that is not, we know that that's not always the case.
Yeah.
Right. So then again, a technology that works against the value system of the society using it, no matter how wrong-headed we think that value system is that technology going to be successful?
Right. Right. Having that application.
If it's working contrary to the widely held value system in society, can the technology succeed? Can people adopt it?
Yeah.
So that's less of an ethical question and just more of a practical one. Can it actually work?
Yeah. But you raised an interesting point there, and I think that segues very nicely onto our idea of ownership, because we decide what's rational and what is a value system is kind of like saying, well, who decides what those things are? And we've talked about in bias and autonomy how creating frameworks and creating structures around certain behaviors and certain outcomes needs to be checked. Okay, great, but then who's actually going to say so? Who's going to do it? So we can now, I think, talk about ownership in a bit more of in a thoughtful way as well, because, and again, as I said earlier, this is something that I think about quite a lot, because as the companies own the algorithmic IP, they own the data, and they are increasingly stockpiling talented machine learning engineers. They're the ones who are, kind of gathering up the digital land, so to speak. And I have this idea of you've got your digital lords and your digital serfs, and the digital serfs are just going to be tilling the land, so to speak, providing their data, but really being obsequious, being subservient to the owners, right? And it's almost like a throwback to 19th century kind of industrialization, where you had a huge disparity. So I think, do you think that's going to be a challenge, and what do you think will happen in that kind of world?
Yeah. So I think that there's something really interesting that singles out what's happening with specifically software technology as compared to previous technological revolutions, right? In the past, I guess you either had, let's say, industrial innovations, where quite often, not always, right, but quite often something appeared that was not replacing anything else, right? So, for instance, we can think of mass production of musical instruments, right? So obviously there were craftsmen who would build musical instruments for 6 to a dozen people before that. And then someone would industrialize that and suddenly start building tens of thousands of them for, many more inspiring musicians, right? So the craftsmen who were doing work before, they didn't like the thought of this, but actually people who wanted custom-made instruments kept going to them, so they didn't actually lose out much to that. And then you had innovations in the consumer market. So for instance, with automobiles, right? We replaced, horse and carriages or walking on your 2 feet. And so whoever was making a living from riding people around in a carriage could hypothetically buy an automobile and continue working, right? What we're seeing with software is absorbing huge amounts of value from the labor market, concentrating it in sometimes the hands of a few dozen people, right? You might compare, if you want to think of a comparable example, you might think of the industrialization of agriculture. Agriculture was a huge source of income for, populations. And then when agriculture industrialized, that became concentrated, but nothing to the same degree as what we're seeing with software. So that's fine until there, right? But the point that people need to realize is that these systems cannot function without human labor, right? So if you think of a machine translation system, you cannot, your system will not work without a huge data set of real human translations for it to learn from and for it to continue steering it in the right direction. And those sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of translations are the source of, I don't know how many hours of human labor, right? So when we're speaking about ownership here, so who is to say that the owners of the algorithm who spent maybe several hundred hours developing this system have so much more claim to the value it creates than the tens or hundreds of thousands of hours spent by the human translators who are teaching the system how to work.
Because obviously the machine wouldn't learn without that initial input. So there's almost like, we talk about data is quite a big topic now, and data privacy and data security and so on, but almost ownership needs to be another part of that conversation, because I own my own data, but what is actually my data worth? And am I getting value from my own data? Especially if I've done something that contributes to, as you said, a translation algorithm, will I be remunerated sufficiently and appropriately for that task? Right now, that's obviously not happening, but that's critical as a starting point. The other element is this idea of is on rent, basically. If I'm consumer and I'm reliant on this algorithm to do whatever it is that I do, I'm all of a sudden have very few options. I have to use this specific service, and this is the way that without having any other options or means, and we're going to talk about the future of work in a second too, but this is where it becomes very problematic, right, in terms of who has what rights and what responsibilities. But I find that a very kind of scary idea of this huge concentration and kind of mobilization of the resources, and maybe there'll be an antitrust movement as well. But we're kind of running close to time because I want to touch on one more topic, which is sort of what do we think life is going to be like in this kind of post-automation era, where we have mass adoption of algorithms. Robotics would be very common, obviously powered by AI and different types of machine learning models working together. What do you think? Pros, cons. What are your thoughts?
So there's some people are starting to talk about the possibility of an economy of stasis, right? And this is one of the risks of automation. I'll try to explain that, right? So we moved from until recently, until basically, I don't know, hundreds, maybe 1,000 or so years ago, we lived forever in an economy of stasis where resources were constant, right? There was very little opportunity for innovation, or innovation was very slow. So if you were just an average human, the probability of you changing human life by doing something differently was quite small. So in those cases, what ends up happening usually is human life starts revolving around fighting for and control of resources, right? Because the way to improve life isn't through getting more value out of what you have, but through just getting some more of what's already there.
Sure.
So if in the hypothetical scenario in the future, if you think about the labor force, you know, the rate of automation of human labor trending towards 100%, right? At that point, it's very possible that you arrive again at the situation of an economy of stasis, where humans have no way to improve their lives through innovation, right? And then what happens then? Maybe one possibility is people return to this activity of just spending your life fighting for whatever is there, which probably in this case would be fighting over control of these systems, these algorithms. So that doesn't necessarily need to look like a sort of neo-feudal, futuristic landscape, you know, some kind of sci-fi.
Post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Yeah. So Game of Thrones meets Star Trek or something.
Right,
but you know, but it could look like just a fairly boring life where all people are doing is arguing about the next election all day, not working, and just waiting to see if they can get a little bit more or a little bit less in a couple of years. So.
And that's an interesting, you know, problem is really this idea of, you know, okay, post-automation, you know, what if 90% of jobs are eliminated? I think separately to a financial situation is what's the situation for us as human beings, because so much of our existential happiness and purpose in life is tied to work and tied to some kind of progression, right? And I don't mean just work in a career. I mean, it could be raising a family. It could be some kind of project. Anything that you can see progress through, I think there's a real deep psychological anchor there for us. And so what happens when the majority of the population is illiterate in the ways of constructing a life that is independent of work, school, family, and so on? And obviously you can still raise a family, right, provided there's means, but I would just wonder, what is going to be the mental health impact on society, the impact on depression? I can just picture us all sitting on our phones and scrolling through Instagram. But what does that look like? I think that's a really fascinating topic that I'm not really equipped to discuss too much because I don't have the psychological background. But I think that's one thing. And the other thing is financial, right? So we talked about, you know, obviously universal basic income is this topic that people bring up all the time. And as you said about elections, you know, are you voting in this one person that is going to promise, you know, a 3% uplift in your salary because that's what you hope to expect? So I think that's pretty challenging topic of conversation to have. And it's not just, as you said, the kind of level of innovation that we get to and what are we spending our time on, but then what's our level of happiness and what are we supposed to do in that life? You know?
I mean, there are positive interpretations of that kind of future as well. They're not all negative, right?
Sure.
So you can imagine, I mean, humans have a tendency to assess each other by their accomplishments, right? And human conflict usually tends to emerge out of resource scarcity, right? So the scarcity of basic resources has a tendency to provoke conflict because there's an underlying desperation there, right? In the situation where there's no resource scarcity, because automation is providing everything we need, you can imagine a situation where people assess each other and sort of grant each other social status based on their creative accomplishments, right? So you can imagine on the other side of this, this neo-feudal nightmare, you can imagine a sort of a creative utopia where we're all sort of, you know, because we're not going to get rid of our instinctive need to assess each other and grant each other status rewards, right?
Yeah.
But you know, you can imagine this other scenario at the other extreme where things might look a bit better. So it's a very interesting thing to think about, though.
Indeed. And I think that sort of echoes, you recommended me actually this great article by Francois Cholet, who's a Google employee, and talks about what worries him about AI. And one of the points that I really appreciated was, he talked about, well, when new technologies came to pass, people either couldn't recognize the correct positive externality or the correct negative externality, because it was all predictive. And he brings up, radio as an example, that while that was a great thing, it also enabled mass propaganda in the 1920s and 30s, right? So, there's a lot of things like this that we can sit here and try and make predictions, but as this evolves and as our lives and society changes, we'll sort of see where it comes to.
Exactly.
It's probably not all going to be doom and gloom. So hopefully, anyway.
Definitely.
Good stuff. Well, Conan, thanks very much. Very successful series of conversations, I think. Thanks for today.
This was fun, Phill, yeah.
Another good session. And thank you for joining us and taking part in these conversations. As always, more than welcome to get in touch for any questions. If you disagree on any of these ethical topics, ethical concerns, or have great insights or articles to share with us, please don't hesitate. Get in touch, hello@digitalgenius.com or over social media. And hopefully we'll be back again on another series about AI